thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today, we're going to take a little bit of time specifically to talk about the NOFOs that are out there and how they impact us at the local level. I have with us today Jennifer Harris, who is the director of the Connected Nation Texas program, as well as Eric Frederick, who manages our Michigan program. I think both of these faces, based on the registrants, are likely fairly familiar faces for you all. I know that Jennifer has set up, or at least has a slide deck today, and so just reading from the screen here a little bit, an overview on the Infrastructure Act broadband programs. This includes BEAD, MMG, and DEA grant programs. With that, I will turn it over to you, Jennifer Harris.
I actually have to click on unmute. You can't just will it in your head for it to unmute. So right. I was thinking, I was like, unmute. Oh no, you actually have to click it. That's the way this works. After all this time and still don't know exactly how to use Zoom apparently. Well, I'm excited to have this conversation this afternoon. Eric and I are pretty much the same way as far as this goes. We want this to be more conversational. So we do have some slides, just most importantly, because they have high level takeaways and they've got some timelines on there. And when we're looking at dates, at least for me, it's always the most helpful to have the dates right there in front of me so you can actually see the dates and how that plays out. We do have a question and answer feature. Feel free to go ahead and send questions in during our conversation, and we'll kind of pause, I think, after each of these individual grant programs for questions on each of those. Of course, we can wrap it up at the end with more questions, but oftentimes, especially when we're discussing 3 separate grant programs, it's going to be more appropriate to address those questions during that time and not talk about 2 other things and come back around. So long story to say, please interrupt us with those questions. We want to answer them. We'll start with a high level. We don't really want to make this a slide presentation. It just is probably the most helpful way to do this. So the biggest program that we're really talking about today is this Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Grant Program. This is the big ticket item as part of the infrastructure bill. It was passed as the IIJA, but it is now more commonly known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, because we needed one more federal acronym to learn about. So we gave the bill another name so that we can call it something else and confuse even more people. But IIJA and BIL are the same piece of legislation. They do the same things, creating these 3 programs and more that we're talking about today. So this portion here is over 40 billion, and that's billion with a B. Overall in the infrastructure bill, it was 65 billion that went toward broadband. So the majority of that did go into this program that is primarily meant for infrastructure. Though certainly these dollars are going to be able to be used on a couple other things that support infrastructure, because as we all know, everyone on this call has heard all of us say it a million times, there's more to broadband than just having physical access. We've got to actually be able to subscribe to it and afford it, and we actually know how to use it. So there are bits and pieces that will fall into this BEAD program that support that adoption and use piece, because those really do mean the infrastructure is going to get used. And so we need to actually focus on all 3 at the same time. So it's exciting to see that Congress recognized that, and the NTIA has recognized that in their notice of funding opportunity. So the big takeaway here is that the purpose of this program is for everyone in the United States of America to have 100/20 broadband service. That is the biggest takeaway and the key here. As everyone on this call is certainly aware, the current definition of broadband is 25/3. 100/20 is a lot higher than 25/3. This does not change the definition of broadband as currently recognized by the FCC, but this does give us a new target to aim for in this country and in our states. And so that is the goal of this program, is literally every location in the United States to have 100/20. That would be a significant improvement, particularly in rural areas, but in pockets of our suburban and urban areas as well, because we do have super urban areas that don't even have 25/3, much less 100/20. So really a great goal to aim for as a country. And we've got the most money we've ever seen headed to us from the federal government to do so. These dollars are going to be split up up among the states. Every state gets 100 million initially, but states will get more based on the number of unserved locations within the state. States like Michigan, states like Texas, states like California, are large population states that also have a large number of unconnected, are going to see in the realm of billions of dollars versus this 100 million as far as how many dollars we expect to receive. All the calculations thus far say that Texas is likely to receive the most out of any state in the entire country as far as funding. And that sounds exciting. Yay for us in Texas. We're getting the most money. Unfortunately, that means we have the most work to do. And that's why we're getting the most money, because we have more people in Texas that don't have broadband than any other state. And so it's a good thing to be first and it's a bad thing to be first, but I'm certain we're going to be very appreciative of all the dollars that we receive and putting those to good use. Another key thing here, and especially for everyone on this call to think about as far as community leaders and working with our communities and figuring out how to prepare for this, is that this program is going to require a match from communities. It's targeted at 25%, though the NTIA would love to see matches of higher than 25%. And so if a project comes in for an area, or there's an area that's eligible on the map, and there's 2 project proposals that come in from broadband providers, and one of them has this required 25% match, and another one has a 40% match. The one with the 40% match is probably going to score higher and be the one where the dollars get awarded, because that means that we actually have more dollars to spend in another location because that match was higher. So it's very important for communities to be thinking about, if you're going to have the money to potentially help a broadband provider. I think, of course, the hopeful intent is that broadband providers are able to do the match on their own, but we know that's not going to be the case for every single provider in every single area. So where communities could step up with funding that they have, where philanthropy can step up, where private business can step up that's not in the broadband world and share in this match, that's really going to help to make these grant applications score higher and that project go through in the area. I'll go through these final key takeaways, and then I'm going to turn it over to Eric for the timeline slide next. But there is a fiber priority given in the NOFO, but that was also called for in the infrastructure bill. I think everyone knows that we would all love to have fiber everywhere if we could. That is probably not possible in every single location in every state across our country. But where fiber is possible, there is a focus on making sure that happens. And our high cost and remote areas, there is definitely flexibility for other technology types that meet this 100/20 standard to be the technology that goes for that area and the grant be awarded there. And there's even a provision in the NOFO saying that if the only application to provide service in one of these high cost areas is for a technology that doesn't even meet this 100/20 standard, but that's the only thing that could get better internet than what's there today, that would be eligible for grant funding. So there is a lot more flexibility than I think has been talked about publicly, because it's a long document. What is it, Eric? 120 something pages. And so there's a lot of nuance to it. But the big thing for communities to understand right now is that there is a lot more flexibility. And that flexibility is only going to happen if you speak up and say what you really need so that someone can ask for the flexibility. If we don't ask for it, we're not going to receive it. There is obviously priority to get to unserved locations first. So any of those locations that don't even have broadband today, then to focus on underserved locations. And then if there's money remaining, work with community anchor institutions. And then the final key takeaway, which I think is big here, any broadband provider accepting these funds is going to have a low cost program. And so if they're going to receive dollars from the federal government to build infrastructure, they can't just come in and build infrastructure and then have high prices that no one can afford, because well, then what have we done with those infrastructure dollars if we're providing a service that no one in the community can afford? So I think that is a good requirement that was added in there. That doesn't mean low cost for every single person that's subscribing, but for those eligible households that wouldn't be able to afford broadband, hopefully they will be able to once this infrastructure is in the ground. It looks like we do have one question. will BEAD include accountability for providers, and what will that look like? Eric, have you dug into that side of it? It's certainly going to have a lot more accountability than what we've seen in previous federal programs. Have you looked into that to give kind of a better response there?
Yeah, so Jennifer, you're right that there's definitely going to be more accountability than we've seen in the past. I think NTIA has taken a look at some of the other federal programs that have been implemented over the last decade plus or so, and the lack of accountability there for those funds that have gone out the door, the lack of validation in the fact these networks were actually built or not. And I think they've taken that to heart. I think states are going to be able to propose different accountability measures and validation measures for these programs to suit their needs. So I don't know that we've seen definitive accountability measures from NTIA, other than saying that yes, there's definitely going to be some, but I think that's going to be what states are going to help define as they're setting up these programs. So I'm going to continue on that thread if you want to go to the next slide, because I think there's a few key things about this program that are what's going to make it work, or what we need to do to make it work in order to truly achieve universal broadband access. Accountability is one of them, but then we also need to be able to think creatively. So like Jennifer said, there's definitely a preference for fiber to the home, fiber to the premise networks in here, but it's going to take, I think, network solutions that are diverse and meet the needs of the community to make this happen. So there's got to be some creative thinking, not only on the technology side, but also on the partnership side, on a community side, to really make sure that we're using every tool in the toolbox that we have to make these dollars stretch and truly achieve universal service. I think it's possible. I believe the dollar amount is high enough to make that happen across the nation, but only if it's done creatively and that we're listening to all of the voices of our communities and underrepresented communities as well, and hearing their needs and making sure that the plans that states are putting together, because again, states are in the driver's seat for this, that those voices are heard and then are reflected in state plans and the development of these programs at a state scale. So creativity is definitely a must for developing these programs. The second is efficiency. We need to implement these dollars efficiently, again, to make sure that they stretch far enough. And we can do that by making sure that we're aligning planning efforts. So in a little bit, we're going to talk about the Digital Equity Planning Grant Program. If we efficiently do that planning program along with the planning program that's required for BEAD, we don't have to have two separate siloed programs. We can, make some efficiencies there and make sure that those dollars stretch even further. So efficiency is another theme that I think is going to run across the board for these funds and these different programs. And then finally, transparency. And this gets back to accountability, that I think states need to make sure that they're implementing these programs in a transparent fashion so that there is true accountability for those that are receiving grants to these programs, that we know the networks are being built on time and on schedule, and that they're providing the service that was promised. So creativity, efficiency, and transparency are really the three overarching principles that I see underlying these programs as we look to implement them. So looking at that timeline for implementation, if that's any kind of a segue, there's really 9 big steps for the BEAD program. And again, these are all, states are in driver's seats. That I'm going to keep coming back to that, because states are really the ones that are going to be driving this and are going to have to be meeting each of these 9 stages of this program. So letters of intent, those are due July 18th. We just got word yesterday that the NTIA has received all 50 states and 6 territory letters of intent for the BEAD program, and so every state is going to participate in this program. So that's step number 1. We can cross that one off of our list. The next step for states is requesting initial planning funds. So every state can apply for up to $5 million in planning funds to really help kickstart the development of this program within their state. And if a state is going to take those planning funds, then they also then have to create a 5-year action plan, which is that step number 3. And that 5-year action plan is where communities and organizations and stakeholders of every type and at every scale are going to get involved in this process. So that 5-year action plan has a number of requirements that states will have to fulfill, including identifying every unserved and underserved location within their borders, doing a needs assessment, an asset inventory, all sorts of things, to really, benchmark where we are with broadband in the state and what the gap is and where we need to be in that plan. So the local coordination requirements outlined in the notice of funds, I think, is really just the bare minimum that states should be doing. And so if you're a community, if you're a region on this call, making sure you're getting in communication with your state broadband offices, I think, is really key to making sure that you're then plugged into this planning process. I know in Michigan, for example, the planning is really going to start in earnest in September or early October, once the approval of these funds has gone through. But I think that's going to be really important for communities and, again, organizations and stakeholders of every type and at every scale to get involved, because broadband touches everything. So we can't afford to miss anyone's voice in this process. And so we need to make sure all those voices are heard and the programs are designed to achieve true universal access and digital equity. So once I'm spending a lot of time on these first 3 steps because that's what we know the most about right now. There's still a few question marks on the timeline for this program. In particular, the next step is number 4, which is the program fund allocation. So in the fall, the Federal Communications Commission is expected to release a brand new updated broadband map for the country. This map is going to be based on locations. So for the first time, we'll have address level availability data for the entire nation. As you can imagine, with a new methodology and with a new map, there's going to be errors. That map then will go through a kind of a challenge process where states and communities, individual consumers even, can report to the FCC errors in that map. That is very, very important because that map is what the NTIA is going to be using to calculate every state's final allocation of funding in this program. So making sure that the federal map is as accurate as possible is going to be critical for every state, so that 1, we're making an efficient use of dollars, we're building to the places that are truly unserved and underserved, but 2, that each state is getting their full and rightful allocation of these funds. So in the fall, again, that's when this map is expected to be published. Again, there'll be that challenge period afterwards. We don't know how long that challenge period is going to last. And then, of course, the question mark is, when is NTIA going to say, okay, when the map is published or challenged up to this date, that's when the allocation decisions are going to be made. That's one of the biggest question marks, because until that date is known, these other processes we don't necessarily have dates for. But once we do, and once every state has their allocation from the new FCC map, then it's time for the initial proposal. And this is really where the rubber meets the road, where states are going to have to define every single aspect of what their programs are going to look like, how subgrants are going to be made, how they're going to be scored, how they're going to be reviewed, and a number of other items in there. Once a state has created that initial proposal, they have to have their own challenge process. So every state is going to be publishing essentially the list of their unserved and underserved locations, which can then be further challenged and better refine that data and make sure those locations that are unserved and underserved are those that are eligible for this program. After that, states will then select subgrantees. So based on that initial proposal, they'll put the information out and select subgrantees to receive funds to build these new networks to the unserved and underserved locations. There'll be a 20% funding release from the NTIA, which can kickstart a lot of those projects. And then finally, the NTIA, with a final proposal after much revision and selection of subgrantees, will then release the rest of the allocation in the BEAD program. So it is a fairly long road to get to the end of this. I know that when we're talking about folks that have been disconnected for a long time, that any amount of waiting is unacceptable, and I would completely agree with that. But there's definitely a lot of steps that states are going to have to follow to make sure that these funds are implemented creatively, efficiently, and transparently. And so this lays that out. And again, the biggest crux of this is that question mark on when the NTIA is going to draw the line in the sand and make those allocation decisions, which then triggers the rest of this timeline. So Jennifer, I'll stop there if you have any other thoughts on the timeline.
Well, not on the timeline, but I do have a question before we move on to the next program. There's a question that says, who determines what affordable pricing is for broadband services, and how long are ISPs locked into approved rates? The second question, I don't know that I have an answer for. I'm not sure that Eric has an answer for. But the first question, who determines what affordable pricing is? That's going to be each state, actually. That is something that states are going to have to determine. There was a conversation in Texas at the most recent Board of Advisors meeting for the Broadband Development Office, where the Board of Advisors started discussing this topic. They certainly didn't settle on any price or get anywhere close to making any sort of decision. They just started the conversation, basically that they're going to have a conversation about this at the Texas Broadband Development Office. And so, you know, in the back of my mind, you know, trying to think through this, I'd argue Texas is a pretty big state, and we've got a lot of unique areas across the state, and saying one price is affordable is for the whole state. I don't know exactly what that may look like, but that is going to be a conversation that's going to be happening within our state broadband development office here in Texas. Eric, has that conversation started in Michigan?
A little bit, and you're right that there is no set definition really. The closest I can find to, well, there's actually two sources of a benchmark, if you will, of how affordability is defined. One is at the FCC. The FCC collects price data kind of on a sample basis across the country every year using what's called the urban rate survey. And that urban rate survey can be used to identify kind of average costs or expected cost of a particular broadband connection based on speed, upload and download speed, as well as any data caps that might be involved. Typically, those rates are much higher than what we see in rural areas because it is an urban rate survey. That data is more reflective of connections in more urban areas of the country. But that is one benchmarking tool that is available to us to help identify at least average costs, not necessarily affordable costs, but average costs. The other benchmark that I've seen over the years comes from the World Bank that has identified 2% of income as a fairly rule of thumb type benchmark when it comes to the cost of broadband service. So if you think about an average family's monthly income, no more than 2% of it should be spent on an internet connection. And even for some, that might be too high. But that is another benchmark that we've seen used over the years. Again, kind of at a broader scale when talking about information communications technology for development when looking at the affordability of broadband. But you're right, it's something that hasn't been defined. There's a lot of prohibition against and rules against rate regulation in the broadband industry as it currently stands. And so we don't even have, regulation on rates that can help us move towards better defining affordability. So I think that's going to be one of probably the bigger questions states are going to have to answer for themselves, and how we're defining affordability. Certainly we have the Affordable Connectivity Program that again has eligibility criteria to participate in that program based on household income and a number of other factors. So there's that angle as well as making determinations about who might be eligible for a subsidy, for example, to make their connection more affordable. But when it comes to defining the affordable price for broadband, that's going to be a pretty complex conversation, I think, that states are going to have.
Before we step away from this timeline, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, stage 3 is kind of where where the local feedback is going to really begin to be important. As we look at that timeline, when do you think we'll start to see the need for that kind of feedback and that kind of participation at the local level? Where does that really kind of land? I know that the previous deadline is August 15th for the requests. And I think there's been some indication that they're going to try to get those requests turned around relatively quickly. So just a guesstimate, I guess, on when we would expect to start having this localized kind of discussion.
Yeah, I'd imagine that those are going to start probably 1st of September and really ramp up in the fall. I think that's when we're going to see states, because you see the 270-day timeline on here. That's a relatively short amount of time for a statewide plan. So I think you're really going to see those efforts ramp up in earnest here in early September and then into the fall is when that really robust community engagement would happen from a state.
And here in Texas, it's starting with the survey that the Broadband Development Office released in February to inform the Texas Broadband Plan. That survey actually remains open. So if you've not taken that survey yet, or members of your community, I'm sure not every single person, every community has taken that survey, because I believe when they published the state broadband plan, it was still less than 20,000 Texans that had taken the survey. So they would love to get a lot more individual responses on that survey. Certainly that's not a community coming together and saying we've decided upon this plan, but that is more data for the broadband office to look at. So that survey is available on their website. And I would say start there now until we get something official from the Broadband Development Office about how they want to receive even more in-depth feedback.
There is another question here. I think is somewhat of a follow-up question to the previous one, related to affordability, and it's from John Eaglehoff. Affordability over time also seems to be a challenging piece of the affordability question. What kind of measures are possible for both monitoring and punitive action for those who don't meet a standard? Would either one of you, any thoughts? I think some of this is still it's a little bit premature from what's going to happen, but thoughts here?
Yeah, I think it does get back to that accountability piece, and I think that's something that states are going to have to build in for the long term, in making sure that affordability measures don't just apply to a certain period of time for a new connection that's built. It has to be addressed over time, and I think this is going to kind of lead into what I want to say about the digital equity program that's coming up, in that we need to make some very systemic long-term changes to a lot of elements of the broadband ecosystem to make things like affordability happen. Something has to give in the affordability space, so that we can make sure that broadband connections are affordable over time and accessible to everyone. Because our current system and we saw it with the Affordable Connectivity Program, which was it's a great program. It's great to have that level of subsidy available to households that are eligible, but it's a Band-Aid for the time being. It's short term. Even if their funding is renewed for a program like that, it's still just a Band-Aid solution. So I think there really has to be long-term systemic change to address issues like affordability and others too, like digital literacy and access to devices and cyber safety and all the other elements that contribute to digital equity. I think there has to be some long-term change there. And I think it does start with that planning effort for states. And it's making sure we're looking at things through that systemic change lens to make sure that we're watching how broadband connections become unaffordable, so that we can anticipate that and make sure that we're finding solutions to solve that for the long term.
Well, I think we'll leave it here on this one, but of course, reach out with further questions at any time. Conversation doesn't end today. Today's conversation ends today, but the conversation on this topic does not end today. So we'll go ahead and move into this middle mile grant program. So this program is just another piece of that $65 billion that came from the infrastructure bill that was passed in November. And this is meant for middle mile broadband across our country. What is different about this program? I think the biggest difference, and we don't even really say it, I guess we do say who is eligible here, but the biggest difference between this program and the BEAD program is this program is actually being administered by the federal government. So applications will actually be turned into NTIA, and everyone in the country is competing for this pot of money. So I know $1 billion, 980 after the administration fee comes out for NTIA to actually do this program. I know that sounds like a lot of money. I make this joke often. If someone handed me $1 billion today, I would not be here talking to y'all. I would have purchased a private island. I would be enjoying, myself there, and we just wouldn't be having this conversation today. But $1 billion as far as middle mile for our entire country is really not a lot. $1 billion for middle mile in Michigan or in Texas, honestly is not a lot. So to split this up across our entire country, everyone knows how large the United States is. This money is going to go very quickly, and everyone who applies is not going to get it. The overwhelming majority of folks that apply for this pot of money, unfortunately, are not going to receive money. However, I do think there's a good chance that a lot of good can be accomplished with these dollars. We do obviously have to have middle mile, because we've got to have a backbone to connect everything else that we want to do, whether that's residential connectivity, school connectivity, hospital connectivity, business connectivity. We need to make sure that we're focused on this piece of the broadband puzzle as well. Same situation here, that it is going to require a match. So there will be a match. I believe if match is higher and you're asking for less money, probably your grant application is going to score higher. I think especially because the NTIA will be scoring applications themselves for this program, and every application will be competing against applicants from all states and territories and tribes, across the country. And so lots and lots of applications here for the Middle Mile Grant Program. Eric, anything you want to add on this slide before we talk about the timeline?
Yeah, I mean, this one's much more of a traditional federal grant program run by the NTIA. Like Jennifer said, yeah, I agree. It sounds like a lot, but it's not when it comes to middle mile infrastructure across the nation. I would expect that NTIA would try to make a grant in as many states as they could to help spread those dollars around, which of course now you start dividing it by 56 states and territories. We're talking about 15 to $20 million size grants, which don't build a whole lot of middle mile fiber, but they could. But I think they could go to unique projects that solve problems that have been persistent in the middle mile space for a state. So that could be one thing to consider, is looking at some very unique projects that I think would get NTIA's attention on this one. Middle mile is absolutely critical. I mean, looking at lowering the cost of last mile connectivity is one thing middle mile can do. It pushes those bigger pipes further and further out from their existing locations to help bring additional bandwidth to more rural places that are going to be seeing these new last mile connections being built because of the BEAD program. Now, that's not to say middle mile costs aren't included in BEAD, because you can use BEAD funds to build more middle mile as well. So this is kind of a little bit of a supplement to that. But yeah, I think it's definitely going to not go very far. But I think it could be a solution again to solve some persistent, unique middle mile challenges that maybe have been plagued certain communities or states over the years.
It looks like we've got another question that's kind of more specifically addressed at the BEAD program than middle mile, but is generally addressed at all funding. So I want to go ahead and answer this now before we jump to the timeline for this program, and then we'll go on to the timeline for middle mile, because this is a very, very good question about all funding. It says, in the past, our county was passed up by RDOF because of inaccurate FCC maps. We were unable to apply for the USDA Reconnect grant because we didn't have a project already planned and ready to have boots on the ground. Moving forward, do you recommend releasing an RFP that scales based on how much funding a county receives to move forward as funds are received and allocated with a plan ready to go? Or is it possible to apply for county eligible grants without a planned project in place? So this is a very, very good question, and one that probably most communities are asking right now. So the FCC maps are changing. As Eric said briefly, we are expecting new maps from the FCC this fall. What we didn't go into more detail on really is that those maps are going to be at address level for the first time ever. He said they will be wrong. They're always going to be wrong, but hopefully they're going to be less wrong than they are at the census block level, where we get a ton of overstatement. Because as I'm sure everyone on this call knows, if there's one home in a census block that has it, they just count the whole census block. We're getting away from that way of talking about broadband availability and going to that address level. Certainly, it's not going to be perfect the first time around. And every time we collect new address level data, we're going to work toward getting toward perfect. But a broadband map will never be perfect. I don't like that. I want it to be perfect. I want it to be exact. It's just one of those things that we're going to get very close to perfect potentially at some point, and keep trying to keep it close to perfect as we move along. And so why this question is extra important is, of course, there's the federal maps, but then each state is going to determine which areas are eligible for this funding for the BEAD program. And with that comes the fact that communities are going to be allowed to challenge these state maps that are developed. So when the state publishes their map of areas that should be eligible for these funds, if you go and look at your county and 0 areas in the county seem to be eligible, but you know for a fact that the whole south side of the county or the whole east side of the county, or a donut hole in the middle of a community doesn't have connectivity, you will have the opportunity to go to your state broadband office and challenge that. But you're going to need to have done your homework to be able to challenge that. I don't think speed test data is going to cut it, saying that we have a lot of speed tests that are not good. I think speed tests are great for identifying where you need to actually put some boots on the ground and look at the infrastructure that's there. Whether that's, an outside plant audit, some just validation of technology, really looking at it, with eyeballs to understand there is physically no infrastructure here, and being able to make a case to the state broadband office for your community is something that's going to be really important to make sure that you qualify. The second part of this question here, though, about counties and eligible grants without a planned project, the primary awarding of these grants are going to be to broadband providers. It's going to be for people that are actually doing the broadband. So if the county itself is a broadband provider, and you're actually going to be providing the service and providing this low cost program and meeting these technology standards and all of these things, that's when a county would become available. But the county, if you're just hoping to get money and then give it to a broadband provider, I don't believe that's the way this program is going to work. It's going to really be for the person providing service to receive those funds, because of all the standards they're going to have to meet. You have to meet the technology of this type that meets this speed. You're going to have to offer this certain, like I said, low cost program. You're going to have to meet all of these other metrics as set forth, and a county is not the one that's going to be doing that. Certainly counties are going to be able to help decide who these providers are. If we look at that match and you want to give a match to a certain provider, you can be a part of the conversation that way. If there's multiple providers that are going after an area in your community, and you submit a letter of support saying this is the one that meets, really what our community is after as far as connectivity, I'm certain that that's going to be taken into account when a grant application is evaluated. But I don't think we're going to see a lot of counties, at least in the BEAD program, that are receiving funds directly, unless they're an internet service provider themselves. Eric, something you want to add there?
Yeah, so when it comes to how the funds are going to be distributed, I think there's some flexibility, because there's the ultimately an internet service provider, and internet service provider could be a public entity, it could be an electric cooperative, it could be an ISP, it could be a cable company, it could be a partnership, a co-op. I mean, there's lots of different entities that are eligible to receive these funds, and like Jennifer said, meet these requirements of building these new networks. But I think there's some flexibility in how those subgrantees and providers are selected, and how the role communities can play in doing that, or identifying places that need to that should be prioritized for service. And I think that's going to come through in that planning process that's going to happen this fall. And I think that's something that states need to explore, is listening to communities, listening to stakeholders, and hearing what those ideas are. Are there models out there that are more creative than what's been done in the past for public-private partnerships? Is there a more efficient way of having communities help in this process in identifying internet service providers? So I think the states have some flexibility in how that's going to be done, but I think it's going to come out during this planning process in the fall. And I think we're going to see some really creative solutions from states, and learning from each other, and how this can be done.
And I guess one further point of clarification, as I reread the couple of questions here about, can you apply for funding without a planned project? I don't think that's going to be the case. This isn't like ARPA, where there was an allotment by county, by city, by entitlement unit. this is for projects that you're going to say, I need $5 to connect 5 homes. Please give me $5. That's what these grant funds are for. It's not saying give me $10,000 and I'll figure it out later. So I don't think it's just going to be awarded in that fashion. So I did want to be clear on that. You're going to have to say, I want $5 to connect 5 homes at this speed. And this is why I need the dollars. And then that grant application gets approved. Okay, we'll switch back to this timeline here, and then we'll get to talk about digital equity, which is going to have all sorts of, I think, great questions.
All right, so this one's pretty straightforward. Again, because it's a standard federal grant program, applications are due September 30th, which is a pretty tight timeline for relatively complex projects, especially when we start talking about permitting and so on. But those are due September 30th. Of this year. The selection process, I see NTIA has given themselves quite a bit of time to review those, as I'm going to assume, just like the last couple of rounds of NTIA grants, they're going to be severely oversubscribed for the amount of funding that they have. So they're going to have to do quite a bit of review and make decisions, hopefully by mid-February of next year. And then, of course, having those projects start in March is the ideal. I'm going to guess that's going to get delayed, but we're going to shoot for March, and then projects have to be completed within 5 years, which is a decent amount of time for a middle mile project. But that's the timeline for the middle mile grant program.
Digital equity. So similarly to I'm jumping ahead and not going to the timeline slide yet, but similarly to the BEAD program, every state and territory did decide to participate in this digital equity planning grant program. So the Digital Equity Act was actually broken into 3 separate parts within the infrastructure bill. And this is the first part. There are actually 2 parts remaining. So this is really the planning portion. So states, territories, tribes, we're all allowed to tell the federal government, yes, we do want to participate in digital equity. We do want to make sure we get some more funding and actually use that funding for programs in the future. And in order to get that funding in the future, each of these eligible entities, states, territories, and tribes, are going to have to submit another plan to the federal government saying, yes, we really do, know what we're going to do with these dollars before we receive them. So there was a deadline this week that we had to, at every state level, territory level, and tribal level, with more detail than what went into the BEAD letter of intent that was due, tell the federal government, yes, we do want to participate. Please give us some dollars to help develop a digital equity plan for every state. Lots of states have state broadband plans, and they have components of digital equity in them. And obviously every state is going to be required to create a 5-year plan on how we plan to connect every single resident of every single state. And that will include some digital equity, but then there's going to be a separate plan for digital equity. These are actually very tied together. Eric can probably talk about that a little bit more strongly than I can about how those 2 plans are going to be tied together. But the key is that every state did decide to do this. All states are in on this to develop a digital equity plan. Once those are turned into the NTIA, there's a secondary program that's going to be the Digital Equity Capacity Program that states are going to be eligible for, and territories and tribes would not have been eligible for that program without going through this grant plan process. The third part of the Digital Equity Act, which we won't talk about today because we don't have any information on it other than we know roughly when it's going to start. We don't have a notice of funding opportunity for it yet, but it's going to be a competitive grant program. And so that will really be the one that communities and nonprofits and all sorts of entities across the country can apply for, that competitive program for digital equity. So really, like I said, Digital Equity Act was rolled into the infrastructure bill. It was broken into these 3 parts. This is the only one that has a starting line that all of these eligible entities have started on so far. Every state did decide to do it. And so they're going to currently start working on their 5-year plans. We'll look at this timeline here about the way this works. And then Eric, if you want to talk about how how this plan ties in with the BEAD 5-year plan and why that's so important. And then once again, why communities need to be intimately involved in both of these planning processes.
Yeah, the digital equity part, while the funding amount is less, is actually the one I'm more excited about, because for the first time we're seeing the federal government start to fund digital equity. I mean, they've been funding broadband infrastructure, right, for a very long time, and the bulk of this funding is going to go towards infrastructure. But I believe digital equity is a much more complex and challenging problem to solve for, and I'm glad states are going to get the opportunity to do that. So, I mean, if we think about infrastructure in the BEAD program, we can think about that as the supply, right, and of broadband, and digital equity is the demand. And so, by making sure that we're addressing supply and demand at the same time, I think states are going to come away being able to more fully address every aspect of the digital divide that they're facing. And so, the digital equity plan has a lot of very similarly worded requirements as the BEAD 5-year action plan, and vice versa. And so some of them are unique, but they really do go hand in hand. I know in Michigan, the plan is to combine these planning efforts into one. It reduces confusion among stakeholders and generating input and getting feedback and helping all of our stakeholders be part of this process. It makes a more efficient use of federal dollars by combining these efforts and so on, and it reduces any siloing that you might have between these two planning efforts, because we certainly don't want that. They go hand in hand, supply and demand. So the digital equity planning grant. Again, all those letters of intent, the letters of intent and applications were submitted, which is great, but we're not going to see these funds start to be awarded until September. So that's why I kept saying September, kind of early fall, is when these planning efforts are going to start in earnest. One of the unfortunate things about blending the BEAD 5-year action plan with this one is that the BEAD 5-year action plan has to be done within 270 days, and this has to be done within 365 days. So those timelines don't exactly line up. But I think for states who are nimble and creative and efficient can certainly combine those planning efforts into one. But we addressing the digital equity needs. This is where that long-term systemic change I talked about before needs to happen. Like I said, the dollar amounts for digital equity are much less. It's great that there's funds for planning. It's great that there's going to be follow-on funds to implement these plans then, like Jennifer said, next year for the capacity grant. It's great that there's going to be a competitive grant, but the investment here isn't nearly high enough to truly address the systemic issues of affordability, access to devices, digital literacy, cyber safety, technical support, all of these other barriers that there are to truly having more digitally equitable and inclusive states and communities. And so I think states and everybody who's practicing digital equity, anyone who has a stake in digital equity, which is a vast number of organizations and communities and stakeholders, are really going to have to get together and identify solutions and ways to implement solutions that are, again, long-term and systemic change to address these topics. Because only then are we truly going to be able to fully leverage the networks that we're building with these billions of dollars in the BEAD program to improve quality of life. And that's what that's what all of this is about, is how do we leverage these networks to improve quality of life? And so I think that's the lens through which all of this effort needs to be done. And the Digital Equity Act really starts to frame that and provide states the tools and resources to do that. And I think as long as states are doing so in a creative and inclusive manner, we're going to start to see some really creative solutions to that long-term systemic change for digital equity.
That's our last slide.
I was going to ask, I thought that was the last one.
Yeah,
So
that is our last slide. So I mean, we can kind of circle back.
So we're right up on time here.
Yeah.
As I said, we're right up on time, but certainly want to, and there are currently no questions in the Q&A, but certainly want to make sure that if anybody has additional questions, they can either post those. Certainly feel free to reach out to Jennifer or to Eric or myself. I'll make sure to get in front of the smart people on today. But and what we'll do is there will be a recording. There was a question early. There'll be a recording of this. I would suspect that will be out by the end of next week. We'll send out a thank you with links to the video to all those who have who are not only participating today or joined today, but those who registered. And then those will be available on the Connected Nation YouTube channel as well. So I'm not seeing additional questions. And so with that, Jennifer or Eric, anything that you would like to make mention of? Oh, someone did post here. How soon will the MAHA office be staffed, or at least a director named? I think that one's to you, Eric.
Yeah, it's definitely a Michigan question. Yeah, so I've been working with Leo on helping stand up that office. I believe that an announcement should be coming in the next couple of weeks or so. So we'll have to wait and see on Leo. I'm fairly certain that the civil service process moves fairly slowly at the state level. So I think that's what they're waiting on at this moment. So I would imagine in the next few weeks we should see that.
All right. Well, any closing remarks from you, Eric?
I think my comments on digital equity really is the summation, is that I think equity is the lens we look at this through. We can't silo infrastructure, we can't silo devices, we can't silo digital literacy. It all has to be addressed simultaneously. And I know that's complex, and it sounds like a kitchen sink approach, but to truly make a difference and have long-term systemic change, I think that's the approach that needs to be taken. And I think communities and all levels of stakeholders are going to play a very big role as long as states are letting them and listening to them in all of this to make sure that these funds are invested wisely.
And Jen?
There's one more question. I'm going to try to get it in before we wrap. It says digital equity seems to invite a discussion about where the dividing line between local action and state action might be. So many solutions beg for local action, but this seems to suggest state action. That would seem to be a disconnect. And I think the way, we're talking about that state, capacity planning grant to then go to the state capacity grants and saying, we need local involvement, certainly, but I think it's going to be on local involvement to make sure that the state is acting in the way that we want each state to act in. And so that's how there will be a disconnect if there is no local involvement in the state planning.
Yeah, and I think John's right in that. I think there's going to be a little bit of both. I mean, I think there's some things that states that can happen at a state level to spark that systemic change and to make sure that there's systems in place that then support local action. Digital equity is a hands-on, boots on the ground process. I mean, I've been working with the Detroit Community Technology Project now for several months, and hearing their stories about trying to get seniors in a building that they serve signed up for the Affordable Connectivity Program is heartbreaking, just because there's a lot of bureaucracy, as you can imagine, in red tape and in running a federal program like that. And so if we as a state are going to implement digital equity and inclusion programs, I think the state is an enabler, and making sure that there's systems and processes and policies in place that enable that local action and then helps coordinate that where the actual work gets done is at the local level. So I think, yeah, we want to make sure we're avoiding any of those disconnects along the way, but I think they work hand in hand.
Yeah. Jen, any last comments?
I mean, I feel like we discussed a heck of a lot just now, but I think my last comment will be that today's conversation is over, but the conversation on all of these are not over. And know that everyone at Connected Nation wants to be a resource to you and your community. Please reach out to us at any time. I mean, that is our whole purpose, is to get, everyone as Connected Nation, everyone in this nation connected. So that means everyone in each of our states connected, and to be here is a resource. And no question is too small, and no question is too large. We'd love to help you to get an answer for, anything that is on your mind. So that's my closing note, is just please reach out to us when you do have questions. We've got a big team spread all across the country, ready to help in any way we can.
Yeah. Well, I want to personally say thanks to my colleagues who it's hard to wrangle with the calendars and the schedules and all the things that are going on. It's hard to even get the two of you together at one time, but I certainly appreciate you all taking the time, as I know some of our community and local leaders do. Just thank you all for joining us. Thanks to all of those who were able to join us today. Again, we'll send out links within the next week or so to this video, and certainly feel free to reach out. You should be able to find my contact in the invites that were sent out. Certainly reach out to your BSMs. I think most of the invitations went out through our BSMs. Feel free to reach out to them. A plethora of resources here at Connected Nation to try to help answer the questions you might have. And with that, we'll close out for the day. Thank you.